The night covered Bethulia with its starry mantle, and the wind blew lightly between the stone houses. Inside, in a simple room, a woman knelt in prayer. Her face was serene, but her eyes carried an intense glow, as if they saw beyond what anyone else could see. Judith was no ordinary woman. Since the death of her husband, Manasseh, she had lived in seclusion, devoting herself to fasting and prayer. Her heart beat strongly for the faith of her ancestors, and every day of her life was a reflection of the covenant her people had with God. But there was something more to her. It wasn't just her devotion that made her unique. Judith was beautiful, not a fragile beauty, but one that challenged. Her bearing was firm, her voice soft, but laden with certainty. When she spoke, each word was like a silk thread intertwining wisdom and strength. The elders of the city respected her, the women admired her, and the men saw in her a light that could not be extinguished. Check out more Bible stories full of emotion by subscribing to the channel now and activating the bell to receive all notifications. If you like the content, feel free to support our work with a donation by clicking on the Thanks a Lot button. You can also become a member of the channel and enjoy exclusive benefits. She walked through the streets of Bethulia with her head held high, knowing every stone along the way, every face marked by time and hardship. The people of Judah had faced difficult times before, but nothing compared to what was to come. The rumors arrived like a hot wind before a storm. An army was approaching, not just any army, but that of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Assyria, who would devastate everything in his path. And at the head of his troops was Holofernes, a merciless general whose thirst for conquest was as great as his cruelty. Judith heard the murmuring conversations and saw the fear in her people's eyes. The siege was imminent. Bethulia was about to be suffocated, and hearts were beginning to waver. The sound of distant drums shook the earth. The wind carried the smell of dust and iron, and on the walls of Bethulia, watchful eyes peered over the hills, trying to see what was already inevitable. The Assyrian army was approaching. First came the scouts, like shadows moving between the stones, analyzing every detail of the fortress. Then came the soldiers, an endless tide of warriors clad in black armor, spears raised like the teeth of a hungry beast. At the center of this storm of men, mounted on an imposing horse, was Holofernes. His gaze was that of someone who already knew the outcome of the battle before it even began. For him, Bethulia was just another city to be wiped off the map, an insignificant obstacle in the way of King Nebuchadnezzar's glory. The gates were locked. The people crowded inside the walls, clutching children to their chests, whispering hurried prayers. The warriors of Bethulia, few in number in the face of that immensity of enemies, held their weapons with sweaty hands, waiting for the order that might never come. But Holofernes was no fool. He wouldn't waste men and time in a direct battle. Instead, he did something worse. He ordered the water wells that supplied the city to be blocked. He cut off the flow, closed off all the escape routes. Little by little, Bethulia began to wither like a flower without roots. Days passed, and fear became a constant visitor. The amphorae of water were emptied to the last drop, the grains rationed to the extreme. Lips cracked, voices grew weak. Inside the houses, mothers tried to deceive their children's hunger with words of comfort. In the alleys, old men closed their eyes, hoping that sleep would take away the pain of thirst. In the halls of the temple, the city's leaders gathered, discussing a fate that seemed sealed. And in the midst of that despair, a name began to be whispered among the elders, a name that could change everything. The air inside the city was heavy. The heat of the day made the thirst even crueler, and with each dawn, people's faces looked more haggard. The children no longer cried, they just looked at their parents with deep eyes, without the strength to ask for what no one could give. The warriors who once held their weapons firmly were now barely able to stand. Hope, that spark that kept Bethulia on her feet, was beginning to falter like a flame in the wind. In the temple, the city's leaders were gathered. Their voices, once full of authority, now sounded frail, tired. Ozias, the head of the council, took a deep breath before speaking, his gaze running over the faces of men who, like him, no longer saw a way out. The people were on the verge of collapse. If God didn't send an answer in a few days, they would have to do the unthinkable: surrender. The news spread through the city like fire through dry straw. Some fell to their knees, crying out for a sign. Others wept in silence. But among all the reactions, one stood out, a voice that didn't tremble, a gaze that didn't turn away. Judith. She heard the words of the leaders, and her chest filled with indignation. Surrender? Wait for mercy from an enemy who knew no compassion? To accept that the children of Israel would be crushed like dust under the feet of the Assyrians? No, that couldn't happen. Dressed in her black widow's cloak, Judith walked to the temple, her footsteps echoing in the heavy silence. The men looked up when they saw her enter, and she didn't wait to be called on to speak. Her voice cut through the air like a sharp blade. How long will you doubt the Lord? How long will you test God, as if he had to obey your timing? The leaders looked at each other, surprised at her boldness. The silence inside the temple was so dense that it seemed to carry weight. The men, used to making decisions, stood there motionless in front of a woman who spoke more firmly than any of them. Judith didn't hesitate, her voice didn't tremble, her eyes glowed like embers in the darkness. Listen to me. You ask God for a miracle, and at the same time you set a deadline for him to act. Who are you to put limits on the Most High? If you believe that he has abandoned us, then give up and surrender. But I won't do that. I trust that he will save us. And if no one else has the courage to act, then I will go it alone. The elders exchanged unsure glances. What was this woman saying? Judith was a pious widow, known for her devotion and wisdom, but what did she intend to do? Before they could ask, she continued, "Tonight, I will go out through the city gate. I will go to the camp of the Assyrians and find Holofernes. God will use the hands of a woman to defeat this army that you fear so much." Astonishment rolled through the room like thunder. A murmur took hold of those present. It was madness. A woman, alone. Judith looked at each of them, waiting for a challenge, an objection, but no one dared to speak. She turned and left the temple without waiting for permission. Her fate was already sealed. She returned home, and for the first time in a long time, removed the black cloak of widowhood. She washed her face, perfumed herself with rare oils, and put on her most beautiful clothes. Every move was a preparation for the battle that would not be fought with swords or spears, but with something even more dangerous: cunning. Outside, the sun was beginning to disappear behind the mountains, painting the sky an intense red, as if the earth itself sensed what was to come. Darkness was already overtaking Bethulia when Judith left her house. But that night, it wasn't just the absence of the sun that enveloped the city. There was something different in the air, an invisible tension, as if even the stones in the streets sensed that something extraordinary was about to happen. She was not alone. Her faithful servant walked beside her, asking no questions, showing no fear. Together they made their way to the city gate, where the guards, on seeing her, hesitated. Never before had a woman asked to leave a city under siege, even more so in times of war. One of them swallowed before asking the obvious. "Madam, where are you going?" Judith didn't stop. She just lifted her chin and answered with the same certainty in her eyes. "Where God wants me to go." The men didn't have the courage to stop her. The gate creaked as it was opened, and the two women left, leaving behind the silence of those who didn't know whether they saw madness or courage in them. The walk to the Assyrian camp wasn't long, but each step seemed to carry the weight of centuries of stories. They walked among the shadows, past boulders, dodging paths that might have been guarded. Anyone's heart would be racing. Judith's, however, beat in the rhythm of someone who had already accepted her fate. When they finally approached the campfires, they were spotted by the soldiers. The blades glinted in the light of the flames as the Assyrian warriors stood, surrounding them like hungry wolves. "Who are you people? What are you doing here?" Judith raised her hands, her face partially hidden by her veil, and with a calmness that would not arouse any suspicion answered, "I am a woman from Bethulia, but I come to you not as an enemy. I bring something that will interest the great General Holofernes. Take me to him." The soldiers looked at each other. A woman walking alone into the enemy camp, but there was something about her, something that prevented them from refusing. Without looking away, Judith waited. The Assyrian soldiers didn't know what to make of this woman. Beautiful, haughty, serene, like someone who knew no fear. A prisoner should tremble before their spears, but Judith walked among them as if she were the master of her own destiny. Night was advancing when they led her to the heart of the camp, where General Holofernes' tent stood like a temple of power and arrogance. The road there was a spectacle of grandeur and oppression. Flags waved in the wind, weapons glittered in the torchlight. Warriors laughed and celebrated, confident that Bethulia would fall in a few days. But little did they know that victory was no longer in their hands. At the entrance to the tent, Judith was announced. The guards stepped aside, and in a few seconds she was standing before the man who, until that moment, had seemed invincible. Holofernes looked her up and down, like a hunter assessing his prey. He was a hard man to look at, used to subduing entire nations effortlessly. But there, in that tent, surrounded by gold, wine, and warriors, ready to obey his slightest order, he felt something he hadn't expected: curiosity. "Who are you, woman?" Her voice was deep, full of disdain. Judith bowed her head slightly, but not submissively, just enough to make her presence seem even more intriguing. "I'm a woman from Bethulia," she replied sweetly, "and I've come to bring something that will be of interest to you. I know that my city will fall. I know that there is no force in Judah capable of resisting your army, but I also know other things that could be very useful to you." Holofernes leaned back on his makeshift throne, a slight smile on his lips. He had heard many pleas, had seen kings and princes drag themselves to his feet, begging for mercy. But this woman wasn't asking for anything. She was offering. Judith's eyes met his, and in that instant, the game began. Holofernes looked at her with a mixture of interest and suspicion. A woman like that didn't appear before him every day. Judith was different. Her gaze didn't tremble, her voice didn't carry the pleading of the defeated. She spoke like someone who knew exactly where she was stepping. He leaned in slightly, measuring every word that would come out of her mouth. "And what could a woman from Bethulia offer me?" Judith smiled slightly, a discreet, calculated smile. She knew that curiosity was as strong a lure as any well-laid trap. "Information," she said softly. "I know that Bethulia cannot resist your army, but I also know that my people trust that God will save them. They are weak, thirsty, on the verge of surrender, but they still believe." Holofernes raised an eyebrow, interested. "And why should I believe you?" Judith tilted her head, as if she were a confidant sharing a valuable secret. "Because I'm here. If I were a spy, I would have been killed crossing your gates, but I came of my own free will. If you want, kill me now. But if you want to win this war without losing a single soldier, listen to what I have to say." The words floated through the air like sweet poison. Holofernes relaxed on his throne, laughing softly. This game was beginning to appeal to him. An intelligent, cunning woman, different from the ones he was used to. "And what do you want in return?" Judith looked up at him, letting her answer come out with the slowness of someone who knew she had earned her place there. "Just your trust." Holofernes smiled again, but this time it wasn't just amusement. There was something more there. "Very well, you'll be under my protection. But beware, if you lie, your fate will be worse than that of your city." Judith bowed her head, as if accepting her condition. But inside her, a flame was burning. She had entered the lion's den. Now it was up to her to tame them. In the days that followed, Judith became a familiar presence in the Assyrian camp. She moved among the soldiers like a breeze that no one could hold back. She watched, she listened, she learned. Her soft voice charmed, her confident posture disarmed. Every day, Holofernes became more entangled in his web. Dinners were long. He liked having her around, listening to her words shrouded in mystery, getting lost in the beauty that seemed to grow under the torchlight. She would talk about Bethulia, how desperate the people were, how the right moment to attack was at hand. But she never said everything. She always left a loose thread, something that made him want to hear more. And then came the invitation. "Tonight you will eat with me," Holofernes said, with a smile that mixed command and desire. Judith accepted with the grace of someone who had foreseen the moment. But when night fell, it was Holofernes who became the prey. In the general's big tent, the feast had already begun. The wine flowed freely, and the officers laughed loudly, celebrating a victory that had not yet arrived. But Holofernes only had eyes for her. "Drink with me, Judith," he said, raising his goblet. She smiled, but only touched her lips to the wine. She knew she couldn't lose control. As he drank more and more, she wove her net with words, letting the drink and desire envelop him. The night progressed. Holofernes' eyes were already heavy, his movements slow. He leaned back, laughing to himself, confident that this woman was already his. Today you will celebrate with me," he murmured before his head fell on the table. Silence spread through the tent. The servants had left, and the general was asleep, completely surrendered. Judith stood up without hurrying. Her gaze fell on the blade beside the bed. The war was about to end, but the final battle still had to be fought. Holofernes' breathing was heavy, deep, like that of a man who is unaware of the danger that lurks within him. The wine had done its job. The great general, feared by kings and entire armies, now slept like any other drunk, left to his own arrogance. Judith remained motionless for a moment, listening to the silence around her. Outside, the camp was still vibrating with the sounds of the feast. Laughter mixed with the crackling of the fires. No one imagined what would happen in that tent. His fingers slid along the blade of Holofernes' sword. It was heavy, made for the hands of a brutal warrior. But Judith didn't hesitate. With a slow movement, she raised the weapon above her head. Her eyes, fixed on the man in front of her, showed no fear, only a cold and absolute determination. The blow was accurate. The muffled sound of the blade cutting through flesh echoed through the tent like the dry snap of a twig breaking. Blood dripped down the linen sheets, staining the riches that surrounded the general's inert body. Holofernes didn't have time to wake up. Judith kept her breathing steady. Her hands were dirty, her clothes marked by the blood of an enemy who already considered himself victorious. But she couldn't stop there. Quickly, she picked up the general's head and wrapped it in a cloth. Her heart was pounding, but not with fear, but with the certainty that the liberation of her people had begun. As he left the tent, he found his servant waiting in the shadows. Without exchanging words, she handed him the burden she was carrying. It was time to leave. Moving like shadows in the night, they crossed the camp, dodging guards, distracted by wine and false security. Step by step, the darkness protected them until the walls of Bethulia appeared on the horizon. The first rays of the sun began to tint the sky golden as Judith passed through the gates of Bethulia. The silence of dawn still dominated the city, but when the guards saw her, their eyes widened. She had returned, and she wasn't coming empty-handed. With firm steps, Judith advanced through the cobbled streets, and soon the murmur spread. Doors opened, windows lit up. The tired eyes of the people, accustomed to fear and hunger, found something they hadn't seen for a long time: hope. When she reached the main square, the elders and warriors were already gathered. The high priest Osias approached, his voice laced with disbelief. "Judith!" "What happened?" She didn't answer immediately. With a calculated movement, she unfolded the cloth she was carrying and raised the trophy in front of everyone. Holofernes' head fell to the stone floor with a dry sound, and for an instant the world seemed to hold its breath. Then came the scream. First one, then another. Shouts of shock, amazement, and then triumph. Bethulia awoke to the sound of her own release. The previously faint warriors raised their weapons. The terror that the Assyrians had inflicted on them now changed ownership. With their commander dead, the enemy army would crumble. And that's exactly what happened. When the Assyrian soldiers found out about Holofernes' fate, they panicked. Without a leader, without direction, they ran like rats before the storm. What began as a siege ended in a desperate flight, as the warriors of Bethulia came out of the gates, driving back the invaders with a force that only faith and justice can grant. Judith's name was celebrated. She could have asked for riches, a throne, anything she wanted, but she didn't. She returned to her usual life as if history hadn't turned her into a legend. Even so, her story would never be forgotten. For in times of fear and despair, there will always be those who remember a woman who, alone, faced an army and proved that true strength does not lie in weapons, but in the courage to believe in the impossible. Time has passed and the dust of war has settled over Bethulia. The streets that had once been the scene of fear were now filled with laughter, songs, and prayers of gratitude. The city remained free, and the Assyrians never dared to return. But in the midst of all this celebration, there was one woman who wasn't looking for applause or recognition. Judith returned to her home as if she had never left. She didn't ask for gold. She didn't demand honors. Her victory lay in the safety of her people, in the certainty that God had heard her prayers and answered them at the right time. She lived for many years, respected and admired, but without ever taking another husband. Her strength did not come from earthly alliances, but from the faith she carried within her, and so her story was told from generation to generation, not just as the tale of a battle won, but as a testimony to what it means to trust in something greater than fear. Judith proved that strength does not lie in numbers, but in the courage to act when everyone else hesitates. She didn't wait for a savior. She didn't accept defeat as an inevitable fate. When men were ready to give up, a woman stood up and changed the course of history. Judith leaves us with lessons to this day. How many times do we find ourselves surrounded with no way out, believing that our challenges are too great? How many times do we wait for someone to solve our problems while time slips through our fingers? But Judith teaches us that true faith is not passive. It requires action. It requires courage. It demands the first step, even when the path is not yet clear. And perhaps, at some point in our lives, we will all be called to carry the same invisible blade that Judith wielded that night. Not to strike down enemies with swords, but to cut through the shackles of fear, doubt, and resignation. For there will always be battles to be fought, and there will always be those who, like her, choose to stand up. If you like Judith's story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming, be sure to like this video and share it with those you love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on any new content. Together, let's explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.